discrimination, refugee protection, refugee resettlement, and integration. Prior to moving to Canada, Sunit conducted accelerated and non-accelerated refugee status determination for the UK government for 2 years and worked at the UNHCR office in London, UK on refugee protection and refugee resettlement. After moving to Canada in 2014, Sunit worked at a leading law firm that specializes in Canadian refugee law. He has a Bachelor and a Master of Laws in Public International Law with a specific focus on international refugee law and international humanitarian law. So thank you very much for joining us today, Sunit. Please go ahead.
So Sunit, we can't hear you. I wonder if your microphone is perhaps muted. Still can't hear you, unfortunately.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, very quietly. Are you using a headset?
Yes, I am.
Is there a way to maybe talk more directly into the mic?
Yes, is this better?
Yeah, this is better.
Okay. Okay, so if there's any other sound issues, just let me know and I'll try and resolve them on my end.
Okay,
So
much better now, yeah.
thank you once again, Lorraine and Sarah, for inviting me to deliver the webinar today. And thank you, Lorraine, for the introduction. My name is Sunit, and I am a trainer at the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. And the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program is funded by Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada, IRCC, to provide training, advice, and support to sponsoring groups across Canada. We cover all of Canada with the exception of Quebec, and we have trainers based in each province who are able to assist and support sponsoring groups with regard to refugee sponsorship. Our website has a number of resources and information sheets that may be useful to you, and we also have several recorded workshops and webinars on a number of topics available for viewing on our website. The large increase in the number of sponsored refugees in Canada, and specifically within Ontario, has highlighted the need for greater collaboration between the settlement sector and the refugee sponsorship community. Sponsoring groups and sponsored refugees are increasingly accessing the services of the settlement sector, and your organization and you as settlement workers already may have provided assistance and support to newcomers that were sponsored to Canada as refugees. In light of this, today's webinar is designed for the frontline staff of settlement agencies and settlement organizations and will provide information on the role of settlement workers when working with sponsored refugees, information on sponsorship disputes, breakdowns and defaults, and best practices for responding to refugee sponsorship disputes and conflicts. This is our agenda for today. So we're going to very briefly look into the role of settlement workers working with sponsored refugee. And the main focus of this webinar will be sponsorship disputes, breakdowns and defaults, as well as best practices and what you can do as settlement workers when dealing and managing sponsorship disputes and breakdowns. And then at the end, we have a case scenario, and there'll also be some time for questions and answers. So just a quick reminder as to the role of settlement workers working with sponsored refugees. In refugee sponsorship, a settlement worker's role is supportive. Sponsors are ultimately responsible to IRCC, so they should always be informed and engaged. Sponsoring groups, regardless of whether they're a group of 5, a community sponsor, or a sponsorship agreement holder, have a contractual obligation with IRCC, which arises from the undertaking that the sponsoring group signed when they submitted the application to provide settlement and financial support to the refugees that they have sponsored for the duration of the sponsorship period. Because of this contractual obligation, it is very important to keep sponsoring groups informed and involved with regard to any activities you do or any assistance you provide to the refugee that they have sponsored. In order to determine the level and type of support to provide to sponsored refugees and sponsoring groups, it may be useful for you to review the settlement plan developed by the sponsoring group if they sponsored under the Blended Visa Office Referred program or the privately sponsored refugees program, and of course if they're willing to engage with you and provide you with a copy of the settlement plan. The settlement plan will be a helpful tool in determining the support that may be provided to the newcomer and the sponsoring group, as well as give you an indication as to how well researched and equipped the sponsoring group is. It will also allow you to see where you can use your experience, expertise, and knowledge to assist the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee. It's important to have a good working relationship with the sponsors and to work with the sponsors for the best interests of the sponsored refugee. A quick note on strategic meetings. In order to ensure that the needs of the sponsored refugee are met through collaboration with sponsors, it is advised that settlement workers meet with the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee to assess needs and create or amend the settlement plan. So ideally, if time permits and if the sponsoring group is willing to engage with you, you would have a pre-arrival meeting before the sponsored refugee arrives. And the purpose of the pre-arrival meeting is to open up a channel of communication between you as settlement workers and the sponsoring groups, as well as discussing the services that you're able to provide as a settlement worker and as an organization, and see how you can partner together in order to fulfill and deliver settlement support. The next strategic meeting that we advise, if possible, that you should have with the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee is for a post-arrival meeting as soon as possible after arrival. So the purpose of this post-arrival meeting is, first of all, you'll be meeting the sponsored refugee for the first time. You'll be able to develop a channel of communication with the sponsored refugee as well as rapport, and you can also review the settlement plan, conduct a needs assessment, as well as developing an action plan from that needs assessment to have goals and targets for the settlement plan that the sponsoring group created. And also periodic follow-up throughout the duration of the sponsorship period. So you may be meeting with the newcomer on a regular basis because they are your client, and the newcomer, the sponsored refugee, is who you are delivering settlement support to. But you may also want to meet occasionally, perhaps once a month, once every 2 months, with the sponsoring group, just to give them an update and to keep them informed as to what work and what assistance you are providing to the sponsored refugee. Having periodic meetings is also especially important when the sponsoring group is preparing for transition out of the sponsorship period into month 13. And the transition period begins for refugee sponsorship at month 9. And again, we recommend conducting another needs assessment at month 9, if possible and if time permits, in order to assess what needs to be done in the remaining 3 months so that there's no unmet needs or service gaps when the first day of month 13 rolls around. Moving on to the difference between sponsorship disputes, sponsorship breakdowns, and sponsorship defaults. Starting off with sponsorship disputes. Sponsorship disputes can range from disagreements over the terms of the sponsorship or to differences in opinion on various issues. And sponsorship disputes do not always result in sponsorship breakdown. Sponsorship disputes can occur between the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee. It can also occur between individuals from the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee. Sponsorship breakdown is an official declaration that an irreparable failure has occurred and there's an irreparable failure to meet the sponsorship arrangement. So in certain cases, certain sponsorship disputes can escalate to a point where the terms of the sponsorship are not being adhered to, or there is a failure on behalf of one or both parties to the sponsorship to fulfill the terms of the sponsorship. And the majority of disputes do not always lead to sponsorship breakdown, but in the last year and a half, we have seen an increase in the number of sponsorship breakdowns being declared by Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada. The responsibility for a breakdown may rest with the sponsored refugee or the sponsoring group, and we'll look into the role of the local IRCC office a bit later on in this webinar as to how they determine where fault lies and what the consequences are depending on who is found to be at fault. A sponsorship default is where there is a breach of contractual obligations of the sponsorship or a failure to fulfill financial or non-financial obligations. So what that means is the sponsoring group fails to provide or administer financial support, which they are obligated to do so for the duration of the sponsorship period, or non-financial obligations, which is settlement support. And again, we'll look into the consequences of each of these things when we look into the role of the local IRCC office later in this webinar. A sponsorship default is declared if a sponsoring group has been found responsible for a breakdown and has not attempted to resolve the breakdown. Moving on to a few common reasons for disputes and breakdowns. Starting off with insufficient or lack of support, be it financial or settlement support. Some sponsoring groups may not be providing an adequate level of support to the refugees that they have sponsored. This can be for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that the sponsoring group do not fully understand their responsibilities in the context of refugee sponsorship or the refugee sponsorship process. The sponsoring group perhaps misunderstood some or part of their responsibilities and their obligations. Perhaps there's some misinformation. And in some cases, there is a lack of desire to provide the necessary support. The next common reason for sponsorship disputes and breakdowns is secondary migration. And secondary migration is one of the leading causes of sponsorship breakdown. Secondary migration is where the refugees decide to move away from the community of sponsorship, i.e. the town or city where the sponsoring group is located during the sponsorship period. So under the privately sponsored refugees program and the blended visa office referred program, for the duration of the sponsorship period, which is 12 months, the sponsored refugees have to live in the community of sponsorship or the community of settlement, which is typically the same town or city where the sponsoring group are located. If a sponsored refugee decides they want to move away from the community of settlement and the reason for the secondary migration is attributed to the sponsoring group. The sponsoring group is expected to make all reasonable efforts to coordinate alternative sponsorship arrangements, including the transfer of responsibility to another sponsoring group. If the reason for the move is attributed to the refugees, for example, it may be voluntary, then the sponsoring group is likely to be released from all further obligations. In situations of voluntary secondary migration, the refugees are typically not referred to the Resettlement Assistance Program, the RAP program, whereas if the reason for secondary migration is attributed to the sponsoring group, the refugees may be able to receive financial assistance through RAP once they've moved away from the community of settlement. The next common reason for sponsorship disputes and breakdowns is confusion and/or a lack of information. So sponsors and refugees may be confused about the level of support they are expected to provide and receive under certain refugee sponsorship programs, or they may be confused about the level of support they are expected to provide and receive. This is more commonly the case for sponsoring groups that are new to the refugee sponsorship process, or for sponsored refugees that interact with other sponsored refugees that were sponsored to Canada under another or different refugee sponsorship program. And the reason for this is because, as you may be aware, Canada has 4 refugee sponsorship programs, and the level of financial and settlement support varies and can vary from program to program, as well as the source of financial and settlement support. Even within the same program, for example, the privately sponsored refugees program, the level of financial support that a sponsored refugee may be receiving from their sponsoring group may be different from the level of support a similar family size in the privately sponsored program would be receiving from their sponsoring group. Another reason, or common reason, for sponsorship disputes and breakdowns is unrealistic or high expectations. This is from both the sponsoring group as well as the sponsored refugee. Expectations are completely normal, but they can also lead to misunderstandings and conflict, and in some cases can lead to sponsorship breakdown. Many disputes arise because expectations are not the same. Expectations of the sponsors and the refugees may be unrealistic, and sponsors may have expectations of the refugees that they've sponsored, and sponsored refugees may have expectations of the sponsoring group as well as life in Canada. A few other reasons very briefly for sponsorship breakdowns. One is where there is a separation or divorce in the sponsored refugee's family, and the sponsoring group is unsure which party they are required to continue sponsoring. And the second reason is where the sponsored refugee goes on social assistance or welfare during the sponsorship period and does not inform the sponsoring group. In both of those cases, a sponsorship breakdown will be declared by the local IRCC office, because in the first example, where you have a legal separation or divorce occurring within the refugee sponsorship family, the sponsoring group is obligated to continue supporting the family that has the larger family size, and the spouse that has separated or there's been a divorce with, a sponsorship breakdown will be declared in respect of that spouse. For the second reason, where a sponsored refugee goes on social assistance or welfare, in the context of Ontario, sponsored refugees are not permitted to apply for Ontario Works or receive social assistance or financial support from Ontario Works for the duration of the sponsorship period. If they do, then the sponsoring group is liable and will be held responsible and will be required to pay back the financial support that the sponsored refugee receives back to the Ontario government. something that's changed recently with regard to this stipulation that the sponsored refugee cannot apply for social assistance or welfare, the Ontario Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration, as well as the Ontario MCSS, they've clarified for us that sponsored refugees are able to apply for ODSP during the sponsorship period. So although they cannot apply for Ontario Works for the duration of the sponsorship period, if they are eligible for ODSP, they are able to apply for ODSP and receive financial assistance from ODSP, and that will not impact the sponsorship, or the sponsoring group will not be held responsible. And if you want information on that, we have the memo that we received from MCI and MCSS on that on our website, and it also outlines the procedure for applying for ODSP for sponsored refugees during the sponsorship period, as well as the implications of providing that in terms of they won't be receiving the full support from ODSP. ODSP will calculate and take into account the level of financial support the sponsored refugee is receiving from their sponsoring groups. So that was just a side note, but if you are interested, please visit our website for that memo sheet for more information on how sponsored refugees can apply for ODSP during the sponsorship period. Getting back to the content of this webinar, another thing to keep in mind is that settlement workers can also cause conflicts between sponsors and sponsored refugees. For example, if settlement workers are not keeping sponsors informed about everything they are doing and all of the activities and support they're providing to the sponsored refugee, and the sponsored refugee does something that the sponsor is not aware of or clear about, this could cause some confusion and tension in the relationship between the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee. And communication issues can also lead to conflict. So any one of these issues or any one of these reasons could result in a lack of communication or bad communication between the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee. And that lack of communication can lead or is the catalyst for sponsorship breakdown. So it's very important, and we'll talk about it a bit later on, to make sure that there are clear lines of communication at all times, regardless of whether there is a conflict occurring or whether it's a dispute. It's very important to try and maintain clear lines of communication between the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee, as well as between yourself and the sponsored refugee and the sponsoring group. And the important thing to remember is that you must have a good working relationship with the sponsoring group or one or two members of the sponsoring group in order to work together with them to meet the settlement needs and for the best interests of the refugee. You don't have to like the sponsoring group, you don't have to become best friends with them, but you do need to have a good working relationship with them or with at least a few members from the sponsoring group. Moving on to what settlement workers and settlement agencies can do in situations of sponsorship disputes or conflicts. So we're now going to look into some practical tips for dealing and managing conflicts and disputes in refugee sponsorship and things you can do to try and make sure that they do not lead to sponsorship breakdowns. So the thing we like to highlight here is that reporting the dispute or the conflict to the local Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada office as the first course of action may not be the best action to take in a situation. Now, the exception to this is if there is a breach of Canadian law occurring, if there's violence, domestic abuse, etc. involved, then yes, you report it to the police and the local IRCC. But if it's a dispute related to a sponsorship issue, or there's a misunderstanding, or there's a conflict related to refugee sponsorship, reporting that dispute, that conflict, that issue to IRCC may not be the best first action to take. What we'd encourage you to do as the first step is to engage in problem solving the situation. So engage in problem solving, and we'll look into a few questions that you can ask that will help you in this exercise to determine what is the best course of action to take. Conduct an assessment to get the facts and all of the information before deciding what the best course is. And communicate with the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee. So we touched on it briefly on the previous slide. Good channels of communication, clear channels of communication must be maintained between everybody involved within the refugee sponsorship. So that means you as settlement workers, the sponsoring group, as well as the sponsored refugee. Because if there are not clear lines of communication, then that will result in unmet needs ultimately for the sponsored refugee. And it can also be the catalyst, like I mentioned, for sponsorship breakdown, because nobody is trying to resolve the issue and it gets reported to IRCC, which results in sponsorship breakdown. And also try to mediate or resolve the conflict or dispute. And again, we'll have a few tips for you later on in this webinar on things you can do to try and resolve a conflict or dispute in the context of refugee sponsorship. And then if you are unable to resolve the dispute after engaging in the problem-solving exercise, engaging in the assessment exercise, trying to communicate and bring the parties involved together, trying to resolve the conflict or dispute, if you cannot resolve the conflict or dispute, or if the dispute is escalating, then in that case you would need to report it to the local IRCC office, and we'll look into how you do that in a few slides. So a few things to keep in mind when you are dealing or when you are confronted with a sponsorship dispute or breakdown. Keep in mind the sponsoring group's level of experience with refugee sponsorship. So since 2015, more specifically September 2015, a lot of sponsoring groups, because of the interest in the Syrian and Iraqi refugee crisis, there were a lot of new sponsoring groups that had never engaged in refugee sponsorship that were engaging in refugee sponsorship. So some sponsoring groups, the majority, may be inexperienced with regard to refugee sponsorship. So always keep in mind the sponsoring group's level of experience with refugee sponsorship. Also look into how established and organized the sponsoring group is. So figure out what type of sponsoring group is it. Is it a group of 5? Is it a community sponsor? Is it a sponsorship agreement holder? Sponsorship agreement holders, they tend to be more experienced with refugee sponsorship because they have engaged in refugee sponsorship over the course of a number of years, and they have signed an agreement with the Minister of Immigration and Refugees to engage in refugee sponsorship. Whereas groups of 5 and community sponsors, because they're sponsoring on an ad hoc basis, on a case-by-case basis, they may be more inexperienced compared to sponsorship agreement holders. So look into how established and organized the sponsoring group is, its structure. Are there any co-sponsors involved? Do they have any leads or supervisors for certain settlement aspects? Because that's something that some sponsoring groups do. They will have a lead person, for example, for housing, a lead person for shelter, a lead person for transportation, and that person will take the lead on that issue and be responsible for that specific settlement issue. So try and get as much information about the structure and the establishment of the sponsoring group, as well as how organized it is and what type of sponsoring group it is. Also try and get a copy of the settlement plan that the sponsoring group submitted to IRCC when they submitted the sponsorship application. So ideally you would have had a copy of this already when you were having the pre-arrival meeting, but try and get a copy of the settlement plan so you can look at it and see what level of financial support the sponsoring group committed to when they submitted the application, what level of settlement support the sponsoring group committed to, and who is responsible for administrating the settlement support from within the sponsoring group, as well as where the source of the financial support is. So the settlement plan will be able to tell you all of that information, as well as additional information, again, in some cases regarding the structure of the group, the type of sponsoring group, the accommodation that the sponsoring group committed to providing to the sponsored refugee on arrival, as well as any additional support they committed to providing. So all of that information will be in the settlement plan, and if possible, we highly recommend you get a copy of it. So it's something to keep in mind when you do engage in the problem solving and assessment exercise. Also look into the specific needs of the sponsored refugee. So hopefully you would have conducted a needs assessment already, but do look into the specific needs of the sponsored refugee. And also consider the relationship between the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee. So what is that relationship
Hi,
like?
Sunit.
Do they have...
Excuse me, Sunit.
Yes?
Your voice is fading out. Sorry to interrupt, but it was just, it looked like it sounded like you were further away again.
Okay, oh, is this better?
Yes, can you say something again?
Is it better now?
Yes, I guess it's a mix between, like it needs to be closer, but when the air goes in, it also makes it sound further away. So I'm not sure how to solve it. But
Okay, I'll try and hold it as close as possible.
sorry about that. Thank you.
Okay. So also consider the relationship between the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee. So do they have a good relationship? Is the dispute or the conflict taking a toll on that relationship? Or has the relationship deteriorated completely to the point where there's no communication between those two parties? So moving on to some questions to consider and ask when conducting the problem-solving assessment. What program was the refugee sponsored under? So were they sponsored, if there's a sponsoring group involved, they would have been sponsored under one of two programs, either the Blended Visa Office Referred Program or the Privately Sponsored Refugees Program. So what program were they sponsored under? What is the type of sponsoring group? So is it a sponsorship agreement holder? Is it a community sponsor? Or is it a group of 5? And are there any co-sponsors involved if it is a community sponsor or a sponsorship agreement holder? When did the sponsored refugee arrive in Canada? And this is a very important question because it will help you determine whether the sponsorship period has ended or whether the sponsored refugee is still within the sponsorship period. What type of support is not being provided? So is it financial? Is it settlement? Is it a combination of both? Or is there some other type of support which the refugee feels as if they should be receiving, but they're not receiving? What is the cause of the dispute? So in addition to a lack of support, there may be other underlying issues to the dispute and the conflict. Is the cause of the dispute misinformation or confusion? What are the communication channels like between the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee? If insufficient support is being provided, has the sponsored refugee communicated this to the sponsoring group? If it's misinformation or confusion, have the sponsoring group attempted to communicate and try and seek that information or try and resolve the confusion? Have the sponsored refugees asked the sponsoring group for support? What actions the sponsoring group have taken to resolve the dispute? And also ask for permission from the sponsored refugee to speak to the sponsoring group. So these are just a few questions to consider, and I'm more than happy to share these slides with you after the webinar, and then Sarah can disseminate them to everybody that's attending. So there's no need to write them down if you didn't have a chance, but just a few things to keep in mind and a few questions to consider when you're engaging in that problem-solving exercise or assessment. And these questions will help you understand the cause for the dispute, what the communication channels are like, what level of support, be it financial or settlement, the sponsoring group should have been providing, and what support is not being provided if the cause of dispute is a lack of support. We're now going to look into some conflict resolution tips which may be useful if you have to try and resolve or manage a dispute between a sponsoring group and a sponsored refugee. The first tip is to explain everyone's roles and responsibilities. So as we noted earlier, sometimes the cause of the dispute or the conflict can be a misunderstanding about roles and responsibilities, or it could be misinformation. So having conducted the problem-solving assessment or exercise we just went over, you may need to explain the sponsoring group's role under the program that they have sponsored under and what is expected of the sponsored refugee during the sponsoring period, as well as the level of support, both financial and settlement, that the sponsoring group should be providing to the refugees and the consequences of breakdown and default. So explain what the sponsoring group's responsibility is, what responsibilities the sponsored refugee has, as well as the consequences for sponsorship breakdown and default. And we'll look into those in a few slides. And if you need any information about the roles and responsibilities of sponsors, what is expected of the sponsored refugee during the sponsorship period, and the level of financial and settlement support under the privately sponsored refugees program, as well as the blended visa office referred program, please do not hesitate to contact us, and either my colleagues or myself will be more than happy to assist you. You're also more than welcome to visit our website, where we have a number of information sheets on refugee sponsorship that will be able to assist you with explaining the roles and the responsibilities of the sponsoring group, as well as...
Sorry, Sunit, it's still, the audio is still really problematic. Your voice really goes in and out. Is it possible to hold the mic further away but talk louder? Because I think the when you're speaking, the air blows into the mic and it completely fades away, and then you come in later again.
Okay,
if you can try something, or maybe not directly talk into it, but just louder.
Is this better? Is this better, Sarah?
It's sort of quiet right now.
Okay. I'm not sure if my mic is broken because it's right next to my mouth and I'm speaking directly into it.
Right now is good, but I think maybe it's too directly into it, because it starts out loud and then gets really quiet after a while.
Okay.
Because of the air. We can just keep going, but just so you're aware.
Okay, I'll try and figure it out. But let me know if I do cut out again.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so, and also if you're unsure as to the specific issue that is the reason of the dispute or the cause of the dispute, if it relates to a specific issue around refugee sponsorship and you are unsure, again, you're more than welcome to contact us and we'll be happy to assist you with that. A great resource that explains what the responsibilities of the sponsoring group are, as well as the rights of the sponsored refugees and what they can expect under the PSR program is the rights of privately sponsored refugees document that should be available to download using the control panel on your screen along with 2 other handouts. And we also have that document in a number of different languages on our website. So it's available in 6 different languages, so you can give it to the sponsored refugee directly, and they will be able to learn about their rights and what support they are entitled to from their sponsoring group, as well as what's expected of them as refugees during the sponsorship period. The next tip is to remember that intentions are often good, even though actions may be hurtful. So what we mean by this is that the sponsoring group and or the sponsored refugee may be acting with good intentions and may be thinking that they're doing the right thing, but their actions are the thing that's causing the dispute or the breakdown. So it's just something to keep in mind. People may be acting from a good place, but it may be their actions that are hurtful and that are causing the dispute or the breakdown. The next tip is to avoid making assumptions on the basis of culture or religion, even if you are a part of that culture or religion. Try to de-escalate extreme emotional reactions by reminding parties that the goal is to work together to find a solution and the consequences if a solution is not found, so breakdown and default. You must act to maintain a positive emotional climate by controlling or diffusing negative emotions or attacks, enforcing ground rules that you may have established at the start of the meeting, as well as keeping parties focused on the issues. The most important one is to remain neutral at all times. Although the sponsored refugee may be your client, you must not blame the sponsoring group, but work with them to resolve the issue. You must build credibility and have the confidence of all parties involved, so the confidence of the sponsored refugee as well as the sponsoring group, and have a good working relationship with everyone. When meeting with the parties involved, you must facilitate the exchange of information by active listening, using paraphrasing, restatement, summarization, probing, or clarifying questions. And the only way to do all of these things is to remain neutral. Try to frame the issues that are the cause of the dispute or the conflict in ways which enable effective problem solving and lead to a resolution. Avoid using adversarial language and use neutral terminology that is non-judgmental and non-controlling and non-defensive. And avoid what mediators call the 6 deadly words when resolving disputes and conflicts, because these words can make listeners defensive and stop dialogue and problem solving. And the 6 deadly words are you, but, always, never, should, and must. Moving on to communication, and as I mentioned earlier, communication is the key to resolving disputes, conflicts, and avoiding sponsorship breakdown. That means communication between sponsors and the sponsored refugee, communication within the sponsoring group, communication between settlement workers and newcomers, communication between settlement workers and sponsoring groups, communication between newcomers and any relatives that they may have in Canada that may have acted as co-sponsors, communication between sponsors and the relatives of newcomers in Canada, as well as communication between settlement workers and the relatives of newcomers in Canada. Moving on to reporting to the local IRCC office. So if you've tried the problem solving, you've got to the root cause of the dispute, you've conducted the assessment, you've tried to resolve the situation by meeting with the sponsored refugee and the sponsoring group, if the dispute or the conflict escalates, or if there is, in your view, no hope of reconciling the parties and resolving the conflict or the dispute, then you can report, or the sponsored refugee or the sponsoring group can report the dispute or the conflict to IRCC. All reports of disputes and conflicts are centrally managed by Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada's national headquarters, and that is the email for the reporting line where you would report a dispute or a conflict. Once you've reported it to the national headquarters, the local IRCC office will be notified, and they will contact the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee. And one thing you may need to do is to explain to the sponsored refugee that there's no risk or consequences of reporting insufficient support, abuse, mistreatment, or exploitation to IRCC or to other authorities such as the police. One thing that we have seen recently in some reports that we've heard recently is that some sponsoring groups try to deter the sponsored refugee from approaching IRCC by saying that if you go to IRCC, your status in Canada, your permanent residence in Canada will be revoked and you will be returned to your home country. So you will need to explain to them that there are no risks or consequences in reporting insufficient support, abuse, mistreatment, or exploitation to IRCC or to the police. And again, it's within the Rights of Privately Sponsored Refugee handout that you can download, which is also available in a number of different languages on our website. And just a reminder, if it's urgent, serious abuse or violence, please do contact the police as the first course of action. Okay, so we're going to look into the role of the local IRCC office in disputes. And the local IRCC office, once a dispute has been assigned to them by the national headquarters, their role is to manage that dispute. And that includes mediating between the sponsored refugee and the sponsoring group. And if required, if mediation is successful and the dispute is not resolved, issuing a formal declaration of breakdown to all parties. So just to give you a bit of background as to what happens when the local IRCC office is informed or notified of the dispute by national headquarters. So once the email is sent to national headquarters, they will direct that dispute to the local IRCC office that covers the community of settlement, and IRCC will contact the sponsoring group and the sponsored refugee and will attempt to assist the parties in resolving the dispute, either through meetings or, if necessary, they will arrange for and act as a mediator. If a solution is not found, IRCC will act as the final decision maker when it comes to declaring a sponsorship breakdown. So the mediation process can take a number of weeks, and during this period, if emergency settlement assistance and emergency financial support is needed, IRCC may refer newcomers to local welfare authorities or to the resettlement assistance program. If a breakdown is declared at the end of the mediation, IRCC will determine which party is responsible, and IRCC will assess if they should be found to be in default of the sponsorship. The assessment will include considering if the sponsors have attempted to rectify the situation. Just very briefly, the consequences of sponsorship breakdown and defaults. So if the breakdown, the reason for the breakdown is attributed to the newcomer, it is possible that the newcomer will not receive further assistance from the sponsoring group in Canada, all from IRCC through the RAP program. If the sponsoring group is found to be at fault for the breakdown, then they may be banned from submitting further sponsorship applications until the default is resolved. And if they're a sponsorship agreement holder, they may have their agreement suspended or cancelled. If the sponsoring group is not responsible for the breakdown will be declared as a declaration of no fault, and there will be no consequences to the sponsoring group. Okay, so we're coming to the last part. Sarah, do you want me to go through the case scenario or straight to Q&A?
I think perhaps we can go to Q&A first, if that's okay with you, and then if we have any time left, we can go to the case scenario. That would be great. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Sunit, for your presentation. We do have one question that's come in already, and if anyone else has a question, feel free to type it to us in the question box or to raise your hand using the icon, and we'll unmute so you can speak. So the first question, Sunit, is about confidentiality. So you mentioned the importance of keeping the sponsor in the loop regarding what settlement agencies are doing with refugees. But what if the refugee tells us not to tell the sponsor something? And the reason this has come up is because they've noticed that some sponsors are asking personal questions about families and their decisions after month 13.
Mm-hmm. So if a refugee has come to you in confidence and asked you not to share this information with the sponsoring group, you would have to respect the request from the refugee and not share that information with the sponsoring group. What we would say is if it's an issue that has consequences and needs to be addressed, so for example, if there's a domestic violence issue or there's somebody from the sponsoring group is abusing the sponsored refugee, that does need to be addressed, and although they may not want the sponsoring group to be informed about it, they would need to be involved because sponsors are ultimately responsible to IRCC. So it's a very fine balance to try and find it. I mean, if there's a violation of Canadian law or if somebody's engaging in criminal activities, that would need to be addressed. Similarly, if there's health issues, be it mental health issues or sexual health issues that individuals need treatment for, that does need to be addressed. And you would need to get the consent of the sponsoring group, of the sponsored refugees to share that information with the sponsoring group. But I would say is if there's a breach of Canadian criminal law, then the sponsoring group does need to be informed.
Okay, thank you very much, Sunit. Are there any other questions at this time? I don't see, oh, okay, just a moment. So this is a question about what are the major or general problems faced by sponsoring groups or by sponsored refugees? What are the major problems you've seen in the past and how are they resolved?
So one of the major problems from the context of, or sorry, from the perspective of sponsored refugees is the culture shock they experience when they come to Canada after having been in a situation of protracted displacement. So they've been displaced from their home country or their country of residence for some time, and then they come to Canada. And coming to Canada for any newcomer, whether they're a sponsored refugee or an immigrant, it can be a culture shock. And just speaking from personal experience, I'm originally from the UK, there was some culture shock and a level of culture shock for me coming from the UK to Canada. And that would be the biggest challenge and problem that sponsored refugees are experiencing. Another problem from the perspective of sponsoring groups is they're not sure or they're unsure about the support and the level of support that they should be providing to the sponsored refugee, because they are new to the refugee sponsorship process. They're not sure how to deal with certain issues, and one of the big things they're not sure how to deal with is confidentiality. So if a sponsored refugee discloses something to an individual from the sponsoring group, does that need to be shared with the rest of the sponsoring group, or how is that to be dealt with? So those are a few of the issues. I would say lack of experience from the perspective of sponsoring groups, as well as culture shock from the perspective of sponsored refugees.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I think we're just about out of time, actually. Although that case scenario you had prepared, Sunit, would that be something brief that you'd like to share with us before we conclude?
It is very brief. Perhaps it's just something that people can take away to think about in their own time, if I just go through it very quickly.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so this scenario is based on a real dispute that was reported to RSTP, and RSTP had to intervene and resolve and mediate this dispute. So there's two families, Family A and Family B. Both of them were sponsored to Canada by groups of 5, different groups of 5, under the private sponsorship of refugees program. Family A, their sponsoring group had a house that was available and owned by a member of the sponsoring group, and that's where they planned to have Family A stay for the duration of the sponsorship period. As this house was already available to the sponsoring group, they did in-kind deductions for shelter when they submitted the settlement plan to IRCC as part of the application process. So what that means is they were able to reduce the level of financial support they were providing to the sponsored refugee, as they did not need to give the refugees from Family A money to pay rent. Family B, on the other hand, they live next door to Family A, sponsored by a different group of 5 under the PSR program. Family B's sponsoring group did not have a house that was owned by a member of the sponsoring group and had to rent a house for Family B. So Family B sponsoring group were giving the refugees from Family B money each month to pay for their rent. So these are just a few questions for you to take away. Family A approaches you, you're their settlement worker, and tells you that they are receiving less financial support than Family B, and they do not understand why. Family A also inform you that they've had arguments with their sponsoring group over this, and they've stopped speaking to their sponsoring group completely. So just two questions I'd like you to consider out of this scenario, and I can share the text version of this with you, Sarah, so you can send it to attendees. What are the issues involved? What are the causes of the dispute? And how would you resolve this dispute?
Okay, so I thank you very much, Sunit, for that, and we'll be certain to share the supporting documents with everyone after today's webinar.
Yes, and so thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Sunit, for your time as well. If you have any other questions, those of you who are attending, we can be reached, Lorraine and I, at refugeesettlement@ocasi.org. That's one word, refugee settlement at ocasi.org. You'll receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to today's recording, and as well a list of, that link will take you to a page where you can see a list of upcoming webinars. And at the bottom of the email is a link to an evaluation survey. We would really appreciate it if you could complete that to provide us with your feedback. It really informs what we will do next, and it's good to see what other areas of information or knowledge people would like to see more of. So our next webinar is actually this Thursday, and you can participate in it if you like. The link is on our website on the wiki page, but it will also be, like I said, in an email address, in an follow-up email, excuse me. And I think I saw, was there another question that just came in? Or maybe not. Okay. All right, so thank you so much, everyone, and that's the end